Greek libraries and beyond. Information, inspiration, entertainment. The ancient Greek society was known for having a great interest in literacy and intellectual life. Much was being learned about science and math and logic. Societies were evolving. This is where democracy was born. Many of the scrolls were available only to scholars, scientists, and wealthy people. Philosophy was on the minds of these intellectual people. The very definition of philosophy is a study that attempts to discover the fundamental principles of the sciences, the arts, and the world that the sciences and arts deal with. The word philosophy is from the Greek for love of wisdom. People in Athens gathered in what was known as the Agora, a public square. There they connected with ideas and with other people. They bought and sold things. They assembled to discuss all of the things that they were learning and to connect with ideas. They learned how to think, how to live, and how to govern. Socrates was a Greek philosopher. He was famous for making young people think. He would give them questions and make them think through all of the possibilities. This method of teaching is still known as the Socratic method. His critics considered that he was corrupting the youth of Athens by making them think for themselves. On a day in 399 BC, the philosopher Socrates stood before a jury of 500 of his fellow Athenians, accused of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of corrupting the youth. He was 70 years old and well known to most people of Athens. After the evidence had been given and defended, he was found to be guilty. Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. He would be his own executioner. We know these things because one of his students, Plato, wrote it all down. This is especially ironic because Socrates himself did not approve of writing. He thought that it was not possible to tell if the writer was telling the truth or not if you could not look into his eyes. He also thought that students would be weaker in memorizing if they relied too much on writing. Although a student of Socrates, Plato did not agree with him on the topic of writing. Fortunately, and ironically, he wrote down much of what he learned from Socrates. Plato was 28 years old when Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the morals of the youth of the city. One of Plato's students was Aristotle. Aristotle was considered to be a polymath, someone who knows a great deal about nearly everything. He had a very large collection of scrolls by the standards of his day and taught many people who would be quite successful in many areas. Since his collection was large, he devised a system for classifying and organizing his own personal library. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle. His father was a very successful general in his own right. Aristotle tutored him until the age of 16. Beginning his military career, Alexander conquered most of the known world by the age of 30 and founded many cities, including Alexandria. He never lost a battle. He never forgot what he had learned from Aristotle. Aristotle's classmate Ptolemy became a general in Alexander's army, and then ruler of Egypt. Another former student of Aristotle, Demetrius of Phalerum, was invited by Ptolemy to come to Alexandria to supervise the building of the Alexandrian library. Many of Aristotle's scrolls would be housed there. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all valued education. All had a huge impact on those that they taught, even though their methods were very different. All of them are still being taught today through the works that they helped to collect, organize, preserve, and share. Their students went on to do great things with the knowledge that they acquired. They have each had a lasting impact. That is the value of cultural memory, the passing of information and knowledge to future generations. These Greek philosophers and their contemporaries brought scrolls to Alexandria, to the great library. That library had as its purpose to collect all of human knowledge. But it didn't all stay in Alexandria. When the Romans invaded, they took items with them, back to Rome. Greek items. Then they created more in Latin. When Alexander conquered much of the known world, he carried a scroll of Homer's Iliad with him in his saddlebag. As you have seen in many of your readings, the spoils of war often included what scrolls they could take with them. Either that, or they were destroyed in order to erase any memory of previous kings or rulers. Many of the Roman libraries were in private hands at first. Generals would return from battles with works that they had seized as spoils of war. Obviously, many of the places that had been conquered had mainly Greek works. Thus, Roman libraries generally had two sections, Greek books and Latin books. Caesar wanted Romans to have access to information and knowledge. Many of these libraries became open to the public and were often built near temples. The architecture was intended to reflect the idea that one was entering a temple of wisdom. The Roman expansion eventually took many of these items even further. The Holy Roman Empire spread the Roman Catholic faith everywhere it went. There were many monasteries throughout the world, and the monks copied the materials in order for more people to have access. The collections were preserved and multiplied by the work of these scribes. Your readings have more information on these times and the problems and the opportunities. The Dark Ages to the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment and Renaissance. Society was changing. Knowledge was growing. Through each of these periods, there were people collecting, organizing, preserving, and sharing scrolls and books. Many clay tablets, unearthed much later, have been buried in caves and deserts. Whenever change occurs, there are people who find it hard to adjust. This is certainly true of some of the technology today. But even then, click on this video to see an example of the medieval help desk. The video is 2 minutes and 44 seconds long. Collections, place, service. Throughout time, each of these has taken a starring role in the story of libraries. In ancient times, there wasn't much to collect. Places were not a central role, and service was not yet understood. In the medieval times, there were more things to collect. Churches, monasteries, and libraries were very important as place, but most important as a service. The service was the copying of the scrolls, by hand, which could take years and years each for a monk working from sunup to sundown. Later, universities were founded, and the collections became most important of all. The information was invaluable. The books were very expensive and cherished by those who had them. The service was more in the organization of the information and the guarding of these precious texts. Now, for the first time since the ancient days, the three are more equal than they have been. The collections are very important. The place is important, both the physical building and the online location. Service is huge. Libraries help to choose, organize, preserve, and share by teaching and by guiding people to the right things. When I think of the Middle Ages, I am generally thinking about the knights in the High Middle Ages. But there are three distinct eras. The early Middle Ages began when the last Roman emperor abdicated. There was a government vacuum. Money for supporting the libraries was more scarce. People worked hard to make a living. Literacy was low. The High Middle Ages is the one that I think of. Knights and castles and the monasteries in the countryside. Universities began to be founded, and literacy was higher. There were wars and skirmishes over borders. There was a lot of emphasis on power, and knowledge is power. The late Middle Ages were very dark. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, occurred during this time. From 1346 to 1353, it is estimated that 60% of Europe's population died. The eras of the Middle Ages can be summarized by thinking of those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. Libraries went through a series of changes during this period as well. While private libraries for the very wealthy remained steady, the churches and universities were in a bit of competition for scholars and written materials. During the early Middle Ages, libraries connected with the church were major forces for collecting, organizing, preserving, and sharing scrolls. The church leaders were among the most educated and literate. During the High Middle Ages, universities began to form in order to study many things. Each library serves a different purpose for a different audience. Thus, the things that they collected were often different. Universities would collect more of the secular materials that were not the things the churches necessarily wanted to preserve. By the late Middle Ages, universities had pulled slightly ahead of the collections of religious institutions in the size of the collections and the power of the knowledge that they shared. During the High Middle Ages, universities in Europe were needed. In 1088, the University of Bologna was founded. It specialized in law. In 1109, Oxford began teaching. 41 years later, they were in competition with the new University of Paris, which was founded in 1150. Late in the 1100s, however, Oxford University grew rapidly due to a decree from the King of England that students should not be allowed to study in France. When Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, something in society changed radically. Reading material became more plentiful. There was more to collect and preserve. More people became literate and were able to read for themselves. No longer were the priests the only ones who could read and interpret the scriptures. Now people could read it for themselves. Things were translated into languages besides Latin. This contributed mightily to the Reformation and certainly was a change in society. But even with the printing press, not everyone could afford to buy books. Libraries found themselves in the position of collecting them, organizing and preserving them by chaining them to the shelves. There were very strict rules. The librarians literally had the key to knowledge. At first, you were required to stand at the shelf and read the book. Later, a much more humane method was found, so that the librarian would unlock the book and then chain it to a place where you could at least sit down to read it. At the time that Gutenberg printed this Bible, there were only about 30,000 books in all of Europe. He printed about 180 copies of this Bible. Today, there are 48 in existence, and less than half of those are complete. Until the printing press, the only way to copy a book was by hand. Therefore, if I had a copy and you wanted one, someone would have to spend a lot of time writing it all down. Here is an assignment for you. Go to the discussions for Module 2 and answer the following. How long do you think it would take to copy a Bible by hand? How accurate would the copy be? Why or why not? Another of the handwritten Bibles at the Library of Congress is this one, which is called the Giant Bible of Mainz. You can see the beautiful illustrations around the edges of the page. This is an unusual manuscript because it was all done by the same scribe. It took him a year and 3 months. And this was not written with a modern ballpoint pen or illustrated with special paints from the craft shop. Each color had to be mixed by hand. I was sitting in my living room in Buchanan, West Virginia, one evening in 2014, surfing the internet for information about medieval libraries, when I came across this gem. It was written by John Willis Clark and delivered as a lecture at Cambridge more than 100 years earlier, in 1894. Since that time, it had been hidden away somewhere until it was digitized by Cornell University Library and put up on Internet Archive. If John Willis Clark and I had been working together on writing a book, we could not have had more in common. I would have loved to sit down and talk with him. And because this lecture had been collected, organized, preserved, and shared by someone, somewhere in a library, I actually sort of did. Through his writing, he described what libraries looked like, and even put in some pictures of drawings and how they were run. Click on the book and look at the first 10 pages or so. What does it mean for a library to be seen as a museum? A workshop. Thinking about the library here at Wesleyan, Give examples of how these may still be true more than 100 years after John Willis Clark talked about it. Include your thoughts in Journal Entry 2.2. Libraries were, of course, not just in Europe. We have focused on the progression as it applies to libraries in our perspective in America. As early as 1672, there were libraries on this side of the ocean. And by 1638, John Harvard has donated his collection of books to start the library at Harvard University. John Harvard was an English pastor in America and donated 400 volumes to the young college. This was a time of great interest in starting institutions of higher education in our own country, places that you recognize, like Yale University, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, Brown University, and Dartmouth College. From Socrates and the Greeks to Caesar and the Romans, through the development of Europe and across the oceans, information has been multiplying. It needs to be collected. It needs to be organized. It needs to be preserved. It needs to be shared. Society depends on it. Democracy depends on it. Individuals and nations and religions depend on it. Information is power.